Well, welcome to another episode of Coffee Talk with Encore. Today, our focus is on sharing tips and strategies with clinicians who are new to working in the skilled nursing environment. Well, with collaboration between therapists and the interdisciplinary team being so important, I want to begin today's discussion by reminding clinicians that they don't have to feel alone as they jump into the world of working in a skilled nursing facility, because there are plenty of people around you who can ensure that you have the tools and the resources that you need.
Definitely. All right. So we're going to just dive right in and talk about what you need to know as a new clinician in a skilled nursing facility before you even start providing patient care. So as you're reviewing your patient's charts and getting to know their plan of care and planning out your day, just consider what their preferred name is. So you're not walking into their room and calling them by something that they don't want to be called. Also, precautions are huge. So making sure that if this patient is a fall risk, if they have poor cognition and can't be left alone, maybe after your therapy session is done, making sure that you know that so you don't leave them alone in the room. Any weight bearer restrictions, so on any extremity, making sure that you're aware, even if you're a speech therapist, we still need to be cognizant of those weight bearer status and all of those considerations. And then, of course, in the times of COVID, RSV, and the flu, we need to make sure that we're taking all of the precautions for infection control and making sure that you have the proper PPE for whatever precaution is in place for that particular patient. So another thing that we really try to teach newer clinicians is just being aware that we are entering these patients' residences. So even if they're there in our facilities for a short-term rehab stay, it is still their place of residence for a period of time. So treat that with respect, making sure that you knock on the doors when you're entering the room, providing privacy when you're able to do so. Again, just treating them with respect and being aware that this is their residence, even if for a short period of time.
Before we even knock on the door for the patient, or before we even knock on the door for the facility, we need to make sure that we're looking into the regulations. So there are differences in scope of practice and supervision regulations between different states, and certainly between different practice settings. So if you're coming from an outpatient setting, if that's where your experience is, and you're coming into the skilled nursing facility, make sure that you go back to that scope of practice and really look up those rules for that particular setting. It's also going to be important if you're going from state to state that you look up those rules, because the direct care access settings are different for each state, and you want to make sure that you have the appropriate physician orders before you start to treat your patients.
Now, once you have checked your practice guidelines, you make sure that you have those orders to treat. It is time to start your day. And being a skilled nursing therapist, it's a fast-paced job. There are a lot of people in those facilities that need our help. And it's really important that with that fast pace that we're still providing those client-centered interventions. And a big portion of that is planning ahead, because when we don't plan ahead with our interventions, I think it's much easier to slip into the rut of kind of providing those cookie cutter interventions that are not skilled because they're not unique to our patients. So planning ahead and making sure that you know what you intend on doing that day with the patients. Also, one thing that I found that really helped me with the flow of my day is point of service documentation. Not only did it help just maintain the flow, but it was a good tool to open up conversation with my clients. And I could say, hey, this is how you're doing with your goals. This is where you're at. This is kind of what we're thinking. What are you thinking? I can get their input and make sure that we're continuing to work on things that are important to them. So I think having that conversation is good as well. I also think the quality of my documentation was better when I was doing point of service because I was writing it in real time. So I didn't have to rely on my memory for what happened during that day, or the little scribbles on my schedule that you can barely read at the end of the day because there's just so much there. So, just having all of that information and documenting in real time, I think did improve the quality of my documentation.
And isn't it the case? I mean, what we can do with point of service documentation, it's significantly, the detail that we can include in our documentation is so much better than if we just wait to the end of the day to put that information in. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to point out that we can do with point of service documentation is capture vitals within that documentation. We really want to make sure that we're all keeping in mind that we've got patients that are being admitted to the skilled nursing facilities that are certainly more complex with the medical conditions that they're coming in with. And then for clinicians, what this means is that we really need to be on the watch for potential adverse reactions when we're providing those therapy treatments. So some of the things that we can do is, for instance, we can utilize a pulse ox, or we can monitor heart rate. We can do this both before, during, actually, and after the therapy treatment. Because what this is going to do, it's going to help alert us as clinicians as to whether or not the treatment intensity and the course of treatment that we're providing, that it's adequate for that patient or it's safe for that patient at that particular time. So including that in our documentation, it's certainly then going to help support the need for our skilled interventions.
And while we're on the subject of the importance of documentation and maintaining good documentation in the medical record, it's also important that we are maintaining good documentation when it comes to the care plan. So the care plan is kind of a guide for each resident that is individualized and specific to them. And it's what the facility staff and we as therapists follow as far as their care. So what are their likes and dislikes, their preferences, how much assistance they need with tasks. There's all sorts of information that goes into the care plan. And so it is our responsibility to make sure that if we're upgrading a transfer status or upgrading an ADL status, if we provide them with a walker that they can use in their room, that we're making sure that we're updating that on the care plan. So in some facilities, it's the responsibility of the therapist to actually physically update the care plan. In other facilities, we let nursing know, and nursing provides that update. Whatever the policy is, that's what we need to follow, but we do need to make sure, regardless of the policy, that it does get updated.
Another thing to consider if you're a newer therapist in the skilled nursing facilities is just kind of keeping in mind that therapy looks different for, all of our patients and residents in our skilled nursing facilities. So patients come to our facilities for short-term rehab after a hospitalization, and they're maybe utilizing their skilled benefit, whether it's, straight Med A or a Medicare replacement plan, or if they are residing in our facilities as a long-term care patient. There are things in place that, expects us to be screening these patients on a quarterly basis, be involved with their plan of care to make sure that they don't decline, even if they are a long-term care patient. So just kind of keeping those things in mind as a new therapist will really help in, your success in the skilled nursing facility as well.
I think it's interesting to think about how many different patients you might be seeing throughout your day. And when you look at your documentation at the end of the day, it's critical that if you were to remove that patient's name from the top of that documentation, that you could still identify which patient that was that you saw based on those notes. Those notes have to have the specifics of that patient and the specific techniques that you provided throughout that day. So it shouldn't just say that you did gait training. It should describe that activity to the complexity that you could identify that patient. And that's the same regardless of your discipline. The other thing is that it needs to show that complexity of the therapist so that you can show that it's different than what something that nursing could do or another care provider could do. So if you're looking at that documentation, it should clearly show a technique that you provided that no one else in the building can provide. And then it's going to have to show how that technique helped your patient and related back to one of those goals. So thinking about that technique, and if you can't clearly see how it related back to one of those goals, you need to pull that story in and connect those dots for the reader.
Isn't that the case? And I do think that whether it's documentation, it's the workflow of the day, it's knowing the ins and outs of like the day-to-day routine of things, certainly working within a skilled nursing environment can be extremely rewarding. And when we do as clinicians really take that time to learn what it's like and learn about the regulations and those best practices to follow, we can truly find that working in a skilled nursing facility can really be the best decision of our career. So we really hope that you've enjoyed today's discussion and have learned some tips and strategies on how to work within the skilled nursing environment. Well, we thank everyone for joining us today and look forward to having you tune in again for our next episode of Coffee Talk with Encore.